Now, to get a more detailed global perspective on the risks, challenges, and opportunities in Indian infrastructure investments, we have a presentation by Mr. Lawrence Slade, Chief Executive Officer, Global Infrastructure Investor Association, followed by his discussion with Sudhir Pal Singh, editor, ETInfra, the Economic Times, on the topic. Welcome, Mr. Slade.
Okay, so firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's a fascinating topic, and I think off the back of the COP26 meeting, there's so much to talk about with regard to India. So to help frame the discussion, though, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just explaining who GII are and why we're qualified to talk on this topic, if you like. And I like this slide because it shows very visually sort of just the breadth of our membership, and indeed the investor members of GIA have somewhere in the region of $1 trillion of assets under active management around the world, and somewhere in the region of $200 billion ready to go as dry powder capital to be deployed at any given point in time. And I'm also very pleased to say that we have two major Indian members in NIIF and GMR as part of our current membership roster, which is obviously great news. Following on from that, what I wanted to try and do was to frame today's conversation as to sort of how India fits within the global context, if I can put it like that. And so every year we run a global survey of consumers with Ipsos Mori, and it helps understand sort of just how citizens feel around their infrastructure generally, and then sort of looks at specific countries. And so here we can see that sort of globally about 38% of citizens are happy with their infrastructure, which is not particularly fantastic. And for the sake of comparison, here in Great Britain, the average is actually lower than that at 37%. So, you know, we have a lot to do. And I think as you see, as we walk through, that will help put the broader conversation in focus. Interestingly, though, the investment priorities of the population around the world are moving more and very supportive of environment-related investment. Now, this, I think, really does reflect the fact that climate change is becoming more understood and more known in the general population, which is a really good thing in terms of garnering support for these things. And you can see on the chart there, as we rise up to the top, flood defences, solar, wind, etc., becoming more and more popular. And then also the support that some 60% are in favour or comfortable with private investment. Now, if we look to India specifically, I mean, the headline, unfortunately, at the top there is that 62% of people felt that not enough was being done with regard to their country's infrastructure. But similarly to the global survey, 4 out of the top 5 priorities are environmentally related. And when I was looking at this earlier, I kind of thought, well, it's not perhaps too surprising that local road networks and actually rail infrastructure are also very high in terms of Indian respondents, in terms of the importance they placed on that. But I also think it's important to note that within India, 70% of respondents trust the private sector to deliver against their priorities. And then on the left-hand side there, I think the graph representing that nearly 60% are giving that highest priority to the environment over the economy is a really important feature in terms of just how much importance people are starting to place on things like good water supply and sewerage and flood defences, etc. So what about investor sentiment for India's infrastructure? And again, I think this is in the context of the meeting and our conversation in particular, I think this is a really important slide because it shows that India is actually quite far ahead of what you might class to be sort of other countries in its area, i.e. those outside of perhaps core infrastructure investment, such as the European Union, the UK and the US. So there's a really good story here in terms of just how popular India is, sorry. And I think that's been reinforced, as you can see here, with the FDI number, the foreign direct investment number, which has moved a staggering 62% in a very, very short space of time. So sort of really quite a powerful number there. And interestingly, I mentioned earlier around the support for investor or the support for environmental investment. And I think it's really interesting that actually let's put all support and let's deliver on environmental areas, because actually just improving a country's infrastructure has this tremendous economic boost overall. So there's a really something that fits together neatly there, as we'll perhaps explore, particularly with regard to the national infrastructure pipeline itself. So looking a bit more at that particular area, I mean, I think the numbers in many respects speak for themselves, and 1.5 trillion. So I mentioned earlier that our 65 investor members have around $1 trillion of assets under management at the moment. What India is talking about is the same again, and another 50% of that, to create that 1.5 trillion investment needed within just 5 years. I mean, these are tremendous numbers, and 70%, again, think back to the slide I showed you with in terms of the public support or where the public priorities are, 70% hitting the mark in energy, roads, railways and urban projects. So really important that there is this match here between where the government's spending is looking to go, but also where public support for that is. And then I touched on this a bit more in a moment, but the public sector looking to provide around 21% of that. So, you know, 21% of 1.5 trillion is not in itself insubstantial. You're looking at, again, somewhere in the region of $300 billion. So a substantial amount of money, however you look at that, and a huge amount, as we can see from the chart here, in terms of how you're mobilizing, not just the capital, but actually how you're mobilizing the projects themselves. Now, I thought it would be useful to frame some of the discussion around, you know, what barriers do we see elsewhere, and actually what can we learn from barriers in core infrastructure markets like the European Union and the UK, and how can that be attributed, or how can that be moved into India, and what lessons to be learned, if you will. And I think it's interesting that there are sort of 6 key points here, from the lack of the visibility of a project pipeline, which obviously the National Infrastructure Pipeline is there to try and help. The regulatory regime, so sort of what security investors place around the strength of regulation in a country. Funding models in areas where you're perhaps looking at more nascent technologies. The FDI barriers that are in place, how open is the country to welcoming inward investment from international investors. Tax is obviously a very critical area, and it's something that's been talked about internationally for some period now. But then also political stability, and actually making sure that from an investment point of view, and remember, a lot of our investors are effectively investing pension money. So it's really important that you can see that there is that long-term stability in the environment, in the political environment, the social environment that you're investing in. So I think looking at the sentiment and some of the blockers we see in Europe, and actually understanding and making sure that the Indian government is seeing these and is actually making sure that from an Indian perspective they're strengthening them, is a really critical element to bringing some of this investment into India. But specifically then, looking at India itself, it is seen to be an attractive market for investment. We've seen that in the FDI numbers there. But perhaps ironically, one of the largest barriers is actually that robust physical infrastructure and being able to move around the country. Power generation and transmission are improving, but the transportation infrastructure kind of limits some of that those performance and investments. And our research has indicated that those inefficiencies themselves are costing between 4 and 5% of GDP. And I think as investment levels grow, it's really important that we understand some of the pitfalls of heavy regulation and some of that, how that disincentivizes the innovation and actually slows some of those vital flows of private capital. And the other challenge, I think, is that if we can get everything in place that really makes India a central market for infrastructure investment, I think we need to sort of try and look and see, okay, the national infrastructure pipeline out to the middle of this decade and the 1.5 trillion and the 21% that's being allocated to private investors. Actually, what can we do to make that better? Could we actually attract, rather than 300 billion from private investors, could we look at that being 500 billion or more? And actually, if we could set up that situation, just how much of a difference could we make to our local societies, to our cities, and to the general population, because we'll be able to deliver so much more, hopefully, so much faster. So I think there's a really big conversation to be had there too. And then lastly, I mentioned at the start, India's pledges from COP26. And I think some of these were unfortunately a little bit overshadowed by the 2017 net zero target. From my perspective, and to a lot of people I speak to actually though, that really hides the massive commitments that the government have made that we highlight here in the first 3 bullets, which are quite simply staggering. And as I've said throughout my slides, hitting these marks is going to be very challenging, but boy, are they really impressive. And I think they set the scene in terms of the targets and commitment that India has to delivering a clean economy and working its way towards that. So really, need to be awarded, I think, in that regard. So I hope those slides have given you a quick overview of where we are and sort of where we see India, but also maybe framed investment in India in terms of the global picture, which is what I was trying to do. But so hopefully that's given you a good overview, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Sure, thanks. Lawrence, let me begin this this dialogue by asking you, as a body of institutional investors, how does GIIA look at India? First of all, how big is the opportunity for infrastructure investment here, according to you? Do you think factors like scale or policy push for infrastructure sector investments, which are generally quoted, they will help the country wade through the challenges that are currently there in the system, including challenges like, for example, the pandemic impact on projects and other issues? Or do you think more needs to be done to boost investor confidence?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you and your clients today. It's a real honor to be with you. And I think that the thing about India is it is such a vast market. And I think we've seen with the recent announcement around the infrastructure pipeline, just how big the ambition is from the government, but also just how much needs to be achieved. So it's definitely on the radar. Let's be completely clear about that. And out of the 1.5 trillion, we're looking at several hundred billion that the government are looking to the private sector to deliver. So I think there's definitely an opportunity. We know investors are looking at the country, so that's a major step forward. I think there are definite challenges off the back of the pandemic in terms of trying to prioritize and looking at markets. But we also know, interestingly, that over the last year or so, infrastructure investments have become very popular. They've become a sort of a very stable source of income for long-term investment purposes, so pension funds and the like. And that means effectively that there's a large amount of money looking for the projects that are bankable, that are investable today. So the critical part here is how quickly the Indian government can move from the big headlines into hard policies and a regulatory framework that fits around that helps investors say, India has not only got the ambition, but we can start seeing where the projects are, and we can start seeing how the regulations will fit around that helps de-risk it in our minds and helps actually say, no, we're okay about putting X billion into this market. And I think sort of, some of the headlines around just the sheer scale of renewable investment, those are amazing. But I think the challenges is how we're going to convert those into individual projects and how quickly we can get those up and running. But it positions India very well, if you like, at the start of the race. We're all on the starting line. We've got the global targets that COP26 raised. India's made its announcement. It's put its marker in the sand. Now we've got to work together to deliver that. And I think I say this all the time in these conversations, that we've really got to engage the investment community from day one. Get around the table, sit down with investors and understand what the investment community need, and you'll speed the development up so much.
Okay. Thanks for the great comment, Lawrence. How, if I were to ask you, how confidence inspiring do you really find India's recent attempts like the NIP or the asset monetization plan at ramping up infrastructure creation? So as somebody who is watching the global infrastructure space constantly, how do you look at the provisions of these programs if you have studied them? Also, where do you think India would rank typically among similarly placed countries when it comes to the overall climate for infrastructure creation?
Yeah, well, I think actually that India is viewed very positively. I mean, we've seen the FDI number and the flows of foreign direct investment, which I think is a really good indication. And I think actually a 2020 UN report showed that India is having one of the 5th largest FDI inflows in 2020, which that in itself is a really strong indication of the confidence in the country. I think though, and I'm sorry if I sound like I'm stressing this, I think from an ongoing point of view, and when you look at some of the huge numbers that the government's been talking about, I think we've got to understand how we can maximize or de-risk the investment from the point of view of having those regulatory frameworks in place. So from an investment point of view, and bear in mind, we're talking infrastructure investments, long-term, 10, 20, 30 years out. I need to have the confidence that placing an investment in India has a similar risk level as to an investment in France or in Australia or in Malaysia or South Korea. It is a global market, and India has to make sure that to attract its share of the available capital, it is managing its risk and it's working with institutional partners and multilateral partners to make sure that confidence is in place. So I think it's tremendously exciting from the time I've spent in India over the last few years working and looking at the Greening the Grid project. The determination, the enthusiasm is there. We've just got to see how we can match everything up.
Okay, fine. Thanks for that comment, Lawrence. And I think that brings us to an end of this the short kind of discussion we wanted to have with you. Thanks for your time, and we really look forward to hosting you again on this platform. Please carry on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been really enjoyable, and thank you once again for the very kind invitation.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Slade and Sudhir, for a precise and informative presentation and discussion. Let's move ahead and get into other interesting topics. Stay with us and keep the engagement high on social media as well, using the hashtag ETInfra Investors Meet.